morning, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley, and I'm the Strategic Communications Director here for the History Center and the coordinator of these talks. I'm absolutely thrilled to be welcoming a fantastic panel this evening discussing C.T. Vivian's memoir, It's in the Action, which he co-wrote with our guest, Stephen Pfeiffer. We're also joined by Al Vivian and Ambassador Andrew Young. You can purchase a copy of the book from Karis Books and More, tonight's official bookseller. There's a link to do that in the chat, or there will be as soon as I finish this intro. If you have questions for our panel this evening, they are taking your questions, so you can submit those using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Just keep in mind, we'll get to as many as we can, because I know we'll have a lot to talk about this evening. Tonight's panel discussion is being presented as a part of Atlanta History Center's month-long Juneteenth celebration supported by the Nissan Foundation and a part of the National Civics and History Initiative, the Civic Season. You can find more information on the Civic Season at thecivicseason.com. I will now introduce tonight's moderator and turn it over to him. Ernie Suggs has been a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution since 1997, and he's currently covering race and culture, as well as a variety of breaking national news and investigative stories. A veteran of nearly 30 years as a newspaper reporter, he previously reported for newspapers in New York City and Durham, covering stories ranging from politics to civil rights to higher ed. Since 2016, he has managed the AJC's award-winning Black History Month project through AJC Sepia, the paper's Black News curation site. A 1990 graduate of North Carolina Central University with a degree in English literature, Suggs was also a 2009 Harvard University Nieman Fellow. He's currently on the Nieman Foundation's Board of Trustees and the former National Vice President of the National Association of Black Journalists. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, his obsession for Prince, Spike Lee movies, Hamilton, and the New York Yankees is unmatched. It's okay, Ernie, we won't hold that last one against you. Thank you for being here tonight. We so appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I should have quoted another one of my mentors, Malcolm X, and said, "Make it plain" when you were introducing me. But thank you very much for that great introduction. It is an honor for me to be here today, to be here with Steve and Al and Ambassador Young. You know, as you mentioned, I've been covering civil rights and race in Atlanta since 1997. And I've gotten a chance to meet people like Andy Young and Coretta Scott King before she passed away, John Lewis, Hosea Williams, and C.T. Vivian, who I think Ambassador Young will admit and allow me to say one of the greatest men I've ever met in my life. And when a couple of weeks ago, I go to one of the things during the pandemic to get a little exercise, as I've gotten a couple of pandemic pounds, is to walk to my mailbox. And I was walking to my mailbox a couple of weeks ago, opened up my mail, and I got a letter from Morse. And I walked back to my house, opened up the packet, and I got this beautiful tie. This purple tie that the great Reverend C.T. Vivian wore once. And it was, I think Al, I think Denise, for one of my prized possessions. I've only worn it. This is my first time actually wearing it. I wore it for a photograph to show it off, but this is my first time actually wearing it. So in honor of the great C.T. Vivian, I wear this tie today. But enough about me. I'm going to introduce our wonderful guests, and we're going to have a great discussion. We're going to have a hard out at 7:30, so I want to get to everybody as quickly as possible. First of all, we have Steve, and the way my screen is oriented, I'm just going to go around. We have Steve Pfeiffer, who's the author of this great book that we're going to be talking about today. It's in the action. Steve is the author of more than a dozen nonfiction books, including award-winning collaborations with Southern Poverty Law Center founder Morris Dees, human rights activist Dr. Quentin Young, and former Secretary of State James Baker. His book, Jimmy Lee and James, which I also have a copy of, was a finalist for the Harlem Book Fair's Best Nonfiction Book of 2015. He's also a Guggenheim Fellowship winner and a graduate of Yale and the University of Chicago's Law School. I won't hold Yale against him as a Harvard man. Al Vivian, the young man down there, who's Reverend C.T. Vivian's son. He's a president and CEO of Basic Diversity, a full-service diversity and inclusion consultancy that has been operating nationally for over 45 years. Basic specializes in the interconnectedness of leadership theories and the concepts of diversity. I'm not going to read all the bios because I want everybody to make sure we hear folks talk. But Al, if you look on the website, Al is the man. And he's a former Army captain, which I did not know. So he's also hardcore. And finally, last but not least, this is a person who needs no introduction. Ambassador Andrew Young in the beautiful blue shirt. He's earned worldwide recognition as a pioneer in and a champion of civil and human rights. His lifelong dedication to service is illustrated by his extensive leadership experience of over 65 years, serving as a member of Congress and an African-American, the first African-American U.S. ambassador to the United States, the mayor of Atlanta, an ordained minister, a graduate of Howard University, a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and one of the pillars. And I'll end here. One thing that I do appreciate with my job, and I'm lucky to have, is that I always consider myself having covered what I consider, what I've dubbed is the country's second group of founding fathers. These are Reverend Dr. King, Reverend Vivian, Reverend Abernathy, and Ambassador Andrew Young. So it's been a privilege for me to cover a man who has been on the forefront of changing America. So I'm going to end the introductions there. As I said, you can read all of their bios on the Atlanta History Center's website. But I want to go back to Claire for a second. And Claire, you have a video that you want to start us off with, so that we can get the discussion going about a video about that I actually narrated about the great C.T. Vivian and one of his iconic moments in his life.
Is it what you think and what you believe?
On February 15th, 1965, civil rights leader C.T. Vivian led a group of 40 marchers to the Dallas County Courthouse in Selma, Alabama, hoping to register the followers to vote. On that cold, rainy morning in Selma, Alabama, Vivian and the 40 marchers were met with the type of opposition that civil rights workers had been facing for years, this time in the form of Sheriff Jim Clark.
And we want you to know, gentlemen, that every one of you, see, we know your badge numbers, we know your name.
I'm really telling him, right? And he got upset, but he knew better than to lose he was the kind of guy to lose his temper and just beat people, right? And but the cameras were on him from all over the world, right?
But you're racist in the same way that Hitler was a racist. And you're blindly following a man that's leading you down a road that's going to bring you into federal court.
He turned his back on me and he humped his shoulders up and tried to walk away from me. But I came right behind him and I said, "You can turn your back on me, Sheriff Clark, but you can't turn your back on the concept of justice." And he dropped his shoulders, and he looked over his shoulder at me as if to say, "How do you get rid of this?" Right? And he said, "Turn that light on."
Turn that light on. And we find me, I can't enforce the law with a light, my face. We have come to register.
Yeah. Turn that light out, right? Well, see, that was so he could hit me without being seen. All right. The idea was to take away the cameras. The cameras was real evidence, right?
And this is our reason for being here. We're not blinding me with that light. We're not move back.
But then he was telling the guys to turn out the lights. And when they turned out the lights, that's when he hit me. But the important thing there was that I got up.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street.
What a moment. And I want to start with Steve. Steve, you wrote the book, the great book. It's in the action. Tell us about that video. And I want to actually get everyone's thoughts about that video. But tell us about that video and how that informed you as you were writing this book.
Well, Ernie, and it's a privilege to be here with all of you. And I would say, Ernie, you're one of the great sources for a lot of the information in the book. So I thank you for that. It's actually that video that brought me to Dr. Vivian and writing that book. I was writing another book, the one you referenced, Jimmy Lee and James, about the deaths of two foot soldiers in the movement in Selma and Marion in 1965 during the voting rights effort. And I wanted to interview Dr. Vivian because he was so involved in that effort. And during the course of my interview with him, I was shocked to learn that here was this civil rights icon who at age 90 had never written a memoir and told the story of his life. So that's actually how we began the process of working on that memoir. And during the course of our work, he told me specifically about that event and nonviolent direct action in general. And if I may, I'd just like to read a very short passage from the book in which he describes why he got back up and how nonviolent direct action, which was the animating philosophy for him and Ambassador Young, was so important. He wrote, "It becomes very clear that we can never allow evil to destroy the forces of righteousness, even when beaten down. I had to get back up because otherwise people would have been defeated by violence. We can never allow violence to defeat nonviolence. There can be no questions unanswered. The depth of the human consciousness must be told." With Jim Clark, it was a clear engagement between the forces of the movement and the forces of the structure that would destroy the movement. It was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that. You continue to answer it. It does not matter whether you are beaten. That's a secondary matter. The only important thing is that you reach the conscience of those who are with you and of anyone watching, both the so-called enemy and those who are preparing the battle and anyone else who may be watching. And one thing that I learned in the course of writing the book and working with Dr. Vivian came from Ambassador Young, that it really was important that the whole world was watching this. In fact, I believe Ambassador Young has noted that if the cameras hadn't been there, the Voting Rights Act might not have happened as quickly as it did. Am I getting that right, Ambassador Young?
You're right.
Well, let me ask Ambassador Young a question. What about the concept that Steve said about getting back up? And I had that in my, that was in the video about getting back up. And you witnessed this event. I believe you were there.
I was right in the back of him.
Yeah. So you saw him
about 20 feet back.
When you saw him get back up, and I don't know how long you had known Reverend Vivian at that time, but what did that say about you, about him, and what did that mean to the movement?
Well, actually, Sheriff Clark hit him pretty solid, and he also had a billy club in one hand, and I never knew which hand hit it, but it was a very solid blow. But it was almost as though CT bounced. He hit the ground, and then he came right back up. There was almost no time and he never stopped talking, it seemed. And it was actually, that punch cost Jim Clark $30,000.
And it also broke his hand, right?
When it got to federal court, yeah.
It also broke his hand.
Yes.
I didn't know about that, but
yeah. But what did that mean? What did that moment mean to the movement and to you?
Well, it was at a time when the movement was really, Selma was really a strain. Selma was not a big enough town. Albany, you had about 30,000. Birmingham, you had 200,000. Selma was a little community of about 15,000 people. And so you really didn't have many people to go to jail or to demonstrate. And everybody knew everybody. So nothing was secret in Selma. this was about the third week of demonstrating. And most of the rest of them had been arrested or turned away without registering. But it was beginning to get weary.
Mm-hmm. Al, yesterday was Father's Day. And, we lost your father about a year ago now. It's coming up on a year. What do you, as a son, you were a child when this happened. But when you look at that video now, what do you think about that? As a son and as your father as a civil rights, your father as a father and your father as a civil rights hero?
Yeah, so he was not only he was a civil rights hero to the world, he was also my hero. That video, the first time I saw that was when the movie Montgomery to Memphis came out. And I was a little kid. We were living in Chicago at the time. And I remember getting picked at school when that made TV. Oh, your dad got beat up on TV. I was like, yeah, if it wasn't for that, people like you would be able to vote. So shut up, was kind of my response. But that moment for me always became huge because that was my first time actually seeing him in action in the movement. I knew what he did, but I'd never seen an actual event like that. And the fact that he got back up said so much to me as well as I got older and understood it. But I would also say that the part of that video clip, and that this portion wasn't in that clip, but when you see the longer version of it, is when, well, actually he did say it there, when he's talking to the other man and said, you're not that bad of a racist, but you're following a man that will lead you into court. It said to me that he's even reaching out to his enemy. He's saying to this guy, you're not that bad a person. He's trying to say, you're better than this. Don't stoop to this level. You can still change and go back. And to me, as I got older, that part stood out for me, saying that's huge. And it said a lot about Dad, that even in the face of this serious opposition, he's saying that I'm going to reach out to you and give you the opportunity to do the right thing. That said a lot. And yesterday being Father's Day was my first Father's Day without my father. And that of course was on my mind when I got up in the morning and on my mind during the day. I'm out of town right now. I'm in California, and both of my sons called me to wish me happy Father's Day. And of course, in the back of my mind were the thoughts of my father and me not being able to tell him happy Father's Day yesterday.
So as a father, when you talked about how he was reaching out to his enemies, and that was almost like a teaching moment for him. And we consider him this great scholar of the civil rights movement. What was he like as a father in terms of teaching you guys lessons?
Yeah, he was one of those fathers where you learned from what he did, just watching him in action. And so it was, so Dad traveled a lot, of course, with the movement. So it wasn't like a lot of quantity time, but it was a lot of quality time to where we learned so much. He would teach us little lessons. When you're a kid, your parents will say things to you and it means nothing to you when you're young. It doesn't mean anything to you until you become an adult. And so my father used to always say, and this had to do with the not the great bit of quantity of time, but the quality of time. He would always say, son, life is in relationships. Life is in relationships. And that meant nothing to me as a kid. But as I got older, I realized life really is in relationships. It's who you know, how you get to know them, how you forge those relationships, what comes out of that. That's just so huge. I would also say that the greatest thing I learned was how to be a husband. He and Mom would always, walk holding hands, and he would always say, I love you, to her and to us all the time. We always knew we were deeply loved. And those lessons have carried into how I live with my wife and how I love my wife and how I show love to my kids, which was just monumentous for me.
Okay. Steve, out of the three panelists, you are the one who perhaps knew Reverend Vivian the shortest amount of time, obviously. When you were writing the book and you were doing the research, what was the biggest surprise? What surprised you the most about him, about his life or his work?
His humility. I come from outside without knowing him at the beginning and realizing what an important role people like he and Ambassador Young played in shaping the world that I lived in. And Ernie, over the course of my writing career, I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of prominent people who've done a lot of very important things but clearly he was the most humble of all the people that I've worked with. I really, the fact that he got to be 90, having led such an important life, having been at every major stop along the fight for civil rights, even going back to Peoria in the 1940s, and that he hadn't written a memoir about his life when everybody who's got 15 minutes of fame has written a memoir was really surprising. And so I definitely would say that humility and his grace, and then also learning about not just the fact that he was such a man of action, but that he was such a lover of words and books and had such a huge collection of books, which I know you yourself have written about, was as a writer was also thrilling to me.
Ambassador Young, how about that? You've written your book, your biography, which we all have read and know. How important is it? How important was it for you to get your story out there, and how important is it for your contemporaries to have gotten their story out there?
Well,
and are you surprised you never had a book out?
That's what surprises me about CT, because CT was working with the Baptist Publishing House when I met him in 1960, 59, 60. And he was an editor of a paper and was a professional writer and had a real appreciation of books. Now, I came into the movement, and the chip I had on my shoulder was that I wanted to make sure that when the story was told, it was told by somebody who was on the inside. That as long as the lion is not writing the story, the hunter will always win. I understood that, and I wanted to make sure that we got it right this time. And that was one of the reasons why I came south. I tried not to come to SCLC because I wanted to be a little bit removed so I could be both inside and outside. But the history has been pretty good, frankly. But most of the history was written, and I always kid Taylor Branch, that he was in at Northside High School when Birmingham was going on, and he got it pretty right. But he was always forced to get his information from the New York Times, from Time Magazine, the Constitution. But there was almost nobody inside the room. And I wanted to write a history from inside the room. And so I was pretty honest about the tensions and about the competition. And because I didn't want people to think that we were a group of saints. I hope some of you saw our film yesterday on WSB, For All the Saints. I called them saints, but then I said, they really were a very unusual group of dedicated people who were willing to give their lives any day, any time for what they believed in or for anything that Dr. King suggested. But Dr. King's suggestions were always more conservative than their beliefs.
Ambassador Young, you came down from the SCLC from New York City.
Yeah.
But you're from New Orleans. Dr. King is from Atlanta. Dr. Abernathy, I think, is from Alabama.
Yep.
You said you met Dr. Vivian, Reverend Vivian, in 1959, 1960. He came from Illinois. So,
well, he was with the National Baptist Convention.
Oh, in Tennessee.
In Tennessee. Okay. And I was working with the United Christian Youth Movement in the National Council of Churches in New York.
Okay.
We actually met at a religious education conference, St. Louis, in 58 or 59.
Okay. So, but what was your first impression of him? And was he different in terms of that he came from the North?
No, he was not at all different. In fact, he didn't mention the fact that he'd already been in a sit-in.
Okay.
I didn't find out about his sit-in activities until I think Jim Lawson started talking about it. You see, Jim Lawson was a conscientious objector in Ohio and went to jail for refusing to register for the draft, but then was released to go to India to study Gandhian movements with the Methodist Church. And CT was, both of them were from a period before Rosa Parks and before Emmett Till.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to jump back to Al and Steve, but I have a question from the audience that I want Ambassador Young to touch on, because you kind of touched on it earlier, just a few seconds ago. How was Dr. Vivian's style, persona, and character different from the likes of Hosea Williams and SCLC civil rights leaders of that era, including you?
Well, C.T. Vivian and Hosea Williams were like night and day. Jose stayed up all night. Vivian worked all day. No, Jose was a very complicated man. And I say this with real affection and appreciation. He was born to blind parents. Both of his parents were blind. And so he never really was close to his mother or his father. And he was raised by a grandmother in Attapogus, Georgia. And he had a lot of chips on his shoulders. And he told me that he put his age up when he was 16 or 17. He pushed his age up to join the army because he wanted to go somewhere in the world where he could kill white people legally. And that was the way he described his his service in the army. He was actually bombed in a foxhole, and everybody in the foxhole, there were 11 people in the foxhole. He was on the bottom, and he was the only one that was alive when they came to get the bodies. He spent 11 months in the hospital in England. Then he came back on crutches and tried to get a drink of water at at the bus station in Macon. And a group of kids, young men rather, roughed up this veteran with a Purple Heart and crutches for trying to get a cup of water. Mm. And he decided then that God brought him back to die for his country over here, for his own people. Now, that was all right for him, except that he wanted to die every day. And he was always ready to start a fuss. He was very, but to be fair to him, I should say that he came back, went back to Atlanta University, got a master's degree in chemistry, and was working as a chemist for the Department of Agriculture. So we really took him out of a very respectable job. We couldn't afford to pay him. The Presbyterian Church paid him. But he was clearly determined to give his life in the service of his people and his country.
Mm-hmm. Steve, what about that? I mean, this is obviously not the first civil rights book you've written. So you've, as someone who is chronicling this movement, where would you place Reverend Vivian in terms of his significance and his meaning to the movement and his significance as an American? Well, first of all, he was a great thinker and a student of history. As Ernie, he had a collection of some 6,000 volumes of books, largely from African Americans, dating back to colonial times. His mother and grandmother had instilled a love of history and reading in him, so he was a very cerebral man.
and as well as the title of the book indicates, a man of action. But one of the things I think that may be lost in the fact that, you know, he was starting, as Ambassador Young referenced, in a sit-in going back to Peoria in 1947, then being in Nashville for the student movement in 1960, the Freedom Rides, then, you know, all the stops along the way, Birmingham, St. Augustine, Selma. But then we, you know, we tend to lose sight of some of these heroes of the civil rights movement, of what they did after the 60s. And Dr. Vivian was a real visionary, and that's one thing I really wanted to convey in the book. First of all, like Dr. King and others, he saw that the North was going to be the next battleground after battles in the South, like Selma, and Voting Rights Acts legislation, the Civil Rights Act had been passed. So he came up here to Chicago, where I am right now, and started working here. But he also realized that a lot of the young people who'd been in the movement and had left school were going to need to get back into the educational scene, and that other African Americans had been denied educational opportunities. So he started Vision, which now has morphed into Upward Bound. So there he was, forward thinking there. We've talked a little about the fact that he was at Shaw University. He created really one of the very first models for remote learning called Seminary Without Walls, where people who couldn't come to Shaw could get tapes to pass and become preachers. And then he created one of the first organizations to combat white supremacy in the late 1970s. So I think, and then obviously coming to Atlanta and becoming involved in the business community, and now the organization that Al runs, diversity and inclusion in the corporate and not-for-profit and governmental sphere. So this was a man of great vision and forward thinking, in addition to being the man of action that we saw during the civil rights years.
What about that? I mean, you grew up in the same house as he. Obviously, you're his son, but that civil rights life of his, as he was doing the things he was talking about, Upward Bound, educate, teaching at Shaw University. As this is going on in real time, are you realizing this and understanding it? And what does that mean for you?
Well, as a kid, I realized it. I remember him doing the Seminary Without Walls and having all the tapes done and the package sitting around the house. But I didn't, again, know the significance of it as a child. But as I grew older, it all made a lot more sense to me. But he was always pushing to do things that were the next level. What do we do next? Okay, this battle was won, or this battle is on the verge of cresting to something new. What do we do next? It was always that strategic planning to what comes next, always ahead of the curve, which has been incredible. I mean, when I think about our company now, Basic Diversity, this is our 47th year. So we're like the longest serving diversity firm in existence. And now everybody's, jumping on board. Even the fact that the things that when he was teaching me the business in 1991, 30 years ago, the things he was teaching me, we knew were fact, but we didn't have the research to prove it. Well, now you have Harvard Business Review and McKinsey and Company and Ernst & Young and all of these great big name consulting firms are now doing the research that's proving what we've been saying for decades. So Dad was always ahead of the curve, and it's been wonderful to see it. But so knowing that was happening, still not seeing the full significance of it as a child, but seeing it in fruition as an adult has been incredible.
There was one other thing that I'd like to add before we go too far, and that is that he was the best eater. He ate. He's the only preacher I know that stayed on a diet. And it wasn't just that he was staying on a diet, but on his way home from work, he would go by Morris Brown and he'd run up the steps to the stadium 4 or 5 times, walk up, run up, and walk back down, run up, walk back down. And I think he deliberately purchased that house on a hill. So he'd always have to be climbing the hill to get back home. But he was physically fit. He was mentally fit. He was emotionally fit. I don't think I ever saw him angry. I don't think he was not angry at Jim Clark. He was very much in control of himself, and he never stopped the line of reasoning that he started in his conversation with Jim Clark.
Al, did you ever see him angry?
You know, it's funny. My sister Denise and I were having a conversation about that, about him being angry before, and it was the only time I ever saw him angry was at other people being mistreated. He was. I mean, it was always very focused. You know, if we did something wrong, you know, here's what you did wrong. Here's why it was wrong. Yes, we got spankings. Yeah, we grew up in a black household in the South. Yeah, we got spankings, but it was never out of anger. It was always explained why we did what we did, why we did it, and what was, and this was what that leads to. But the only time I ever saw him angry was at someone being mistreated by someone else. That's when he got angry, and that's the only time I ever saw him angry.
Mm-hmm. In fact, that's what he was doing with Jim Clark.
Yes.
He was interceding in behalf of the other citizens who were being turned away.
Yes.
Steve, what was it like? Now, I know he wasn't angry, but what was it like working with him on the book?
Oh, he was delightful and thoughtful. And I will say one thing though, in doing some of the research, you know, in Nashville in 1960, the student movement there that really was responsible for integrating some of the facilities in downtown Nashville, the first city below the Mason-Dixon line where there was a successful effort like that. You know, on April 19th, 1960, Dr. Vivian and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette led a march of what at that time was the largest civil rights march of the time, about 3,000, 4,000 people to City Hall to confront Mayor Ben West of Nashville about the fact that downtown Nashville, blacks could go into the stores and shop, but they couldn't eat there, they couldn't use the restrooms there, and so forth. And David Halberstam, the famous journalist, was covering that event for the Tennessean, the paper of record in Nashville at the time. And he describes Dr. Vivian as being pretty heated when he confronted Mayor West on the steps of Nashville City Hall and asked him how he could behave like he was behaving if he called himself a Christian. It was almost like he and Diane Nash were playing good cop, bad cop with Ben West, the mayor at that time. And according to Halberstam's contemporaneous accounts of that, Dr. Vivian almost had to be restrained, not from attacking physically Mayor West, but he was just so animated in wanting justice to be served.
Well, he discussed an issue like he preached. He used to say he preached like a train going downhill.
Ambassador Young, before we started, you showed us a painting that Reverend Vivian had given you. You don't have to show it. I don't want you to mess up your camera or your angle. But we all know, and Al, you know, Steve, you know, that in his later life, or all of his life, he became a connoisseur of the arts. He became a connoisseur of great art. He became a connoisseur of books. He went on to have a second act in terms of business and organizations in which he started. Ambassador Young, you had a great second act as well, becoming mayor of Atlanta, becoming an ambassador. How important was it for that generation of great civil rights leaders to be able to do something else in their second half of your lives?
Well, it's the second, third, fourth, and fifth.
Right.
I mean, the thing was that, and I quote this because Martin Luther King said it almost in jest. He said, you know, you got to be clinically insane to think that this bunch of crackpots, neurotics, wild men can change this nation. And he said, none of us will probably make it to 50. He said 40 to 40. And he said, but those of us who make it past 40 are going to have a long haul. It's going to take at least 100 years for us to get this country right. So it was always in the plan that this was an ongoing struggle. Ella's song, Ella Baker, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And that was the way all of us tried to live. And nobody hardly slowed down ever. They went right to their death. And CT was going. He was full of energy all of his life. Mm-hmm. And it was no less at 90 than it was at 45.
Yeah. Every time I saw him, he seemed like he was walking faster than I was. Mm-hmm. Now, I never got a chance to, I don't think I did, ever got a chance to meet your mother. And I think it's always important to acknowledge the women behind these great men. Can you talk a little bit about your mother and the role she played in the civil rights movement? And I want Ambassador Young to kind of follow up, who has known all of these women, and just talk about how important the women were during this movement.
That's a great question, and thank you for asking that. Mom was brilliant, soft-spoken, but really on top of everything. She shielded us and protected us while Dad was out doing the work. She was taking care of us at home, but also shielding us. So, example, Mom and I were leaving the house one morning, and we stepped out the front door, and on the porch there was a huge caliber bullet with a note wrapped around it sitting on the porch. And we walked out the front door. She sees this bullet. She scoops down and picks it up before I noticed what it was. And so I said, "What was that, Mom?" She said, "Oh, nothing." And we just kept going. It wasn't until I was an adult that she actually told me what it was. And she still had the bullet with the note wrapped around it. And so she showed it to me then, but it was a threat. But she made sure we didn't know those things. And actually all the wives of the male movement leaders, that's the kind of role they played. Mom would not watch the early evening news, like, the 6 p.m. news or whatever time it came on wherever we were. Her friends would watch the news and then call her and let her know that it's safe to watch the news tonight. Oh. So she didn't want us to be around and see something happening to Dad or to Andy or to Martin Luther King Jr., somebody that we knew getting attacked or anything on the news. So she would have her friends watch and they'd call on her to know everything was okay. And then after she put us in bed, she'd watch the late night news. But it was all those kind of things. And then I remember Dad telling the story of how when he got the call to go to ministry, how he was finding out at that moment that my mother was pregnant. And he was saying, "Well, I don't know if I should go right now." And she was saying, "Okay, oh, ye of little faith, what's your problem, church boy? You're supposed to be the one." So she had to push him out to make him go. And it's having that strong person that has your back all the time, that's there walking beside you and behind you and sometimes in front of you, that can motivate you and push you to do great things. Mom also wrote the first biography of Coretta King. Yeah. And I remember growing up watching her write the book, and that had a huge impact on me as well. So it's all of that. So thank you for asking about that, because so many times
I need to get a copy of that.
Yes, sir.
I need to get a copy of that book.
Oh, without a doubt. I
have never seen it. Yeah.
Ernie, Dr. Vivian told me that he really never made a decision without consulting his wife, who had been an activist in her own right before they even met. She was up in Pontiac, Michigan, and was integrating restaurants there before she even met Dr. Vivian in Peoria in the early 50s. So she had her kind of own career as an activist, which she put on the back burner to raise that large family. But before he went on the freedom rides, he talked to her to ask if she thought he should go. And before he made any of those important moves, he considered it a real partnership with Octavia.
You know, Coretta's house was burned to the ground when she was 15. And it's interesting to see how she writes about her father's prayer. Because when they came home from church, from choir practice, and saw the house burn flat to the ground, he got them in a circle and made them kneel down. And the first thing they did was pray for forgiveness for the sick people that felt it necessary to burn their house down. And then he had them pray that they would never feel any hatred or malice in their hearts. It was very much the same as the prayer that was given by the pastor at the AME church in Charleston when the 8 people were killed. And it almost makes you feel like there was a nonviolent tradition in Black churches that didn't come just from white churches, that had been a part of the heritage. Like when I was 4 years old, the Nazi party was on the corner of my house. And that's where I got my first race relations lessons. Don't get mad, get smart. Nazis, these are sick people. And you don't get angry at sick people. They can't help themselves. You have to help sick people if you can. If you can't, just stay out of their way. But never let yourself get angry or bitter about someone else's sickness. And that was basically the way we viewed racism. And we're taught not to forget, but to understand and forgive.
We have about 12 minutes left, so I want to ask 2 more questions and get answers from all of you all. Reverend Vivian, as I mentioned, he passed away about a year ago. So he was living through what we're going through now in America. But what are your thoughts about, I don't know, Al, you may have had some conversations with him about what's going on in the country now in terms of with race relations. What were his thoughts and what would he be thinking about as to what's going on now? And I want everyone to answer this as well.
So it's a great question in that, and what I'm going to say right now goes a little bit before that, but it leads up to his thoughts on what's going on now. So when NPR was first making national, the StoryCorps project, and they were going to different cities to get the project going real well, they chose Atlanta as one of their test cities, and they had me interview Dad for StoryCorps. And I asked him a question, and when he answered the question, of course, we're being recorded at the time, but his answer, I thought he was out of his mind, but I wasn't going to say that because we're being recorded. So the question I asked him was, so Dad, being one of the last few remaining members of King's executive team, I know the advice you gave me as to what I needed to do to be successful as an African-American male in America. What advice would you give to the next generation, my sons, your grandsons? And Dad first said, he says, well, son, I don't know. And I'd never heard my dad say, I don't know to any question dealing with race. So I said, you don't know. And then I said, so I'm trying to help myself. Oh, I get it. It's because my generation is the first generation in America to have rights. I wasn't born with rights. I was born in 1961, but I was the first generation where we got our rights. And so he said, no, that's not it. And I said, well, what is it? He says, I'm not totally sure the advice I gave you was the absolute best advice. So I then said, oh, I got it because I'm still around and we don't know what's coming next. He says, no, son. He says, and when he said this, I thought he had lost his mind. He says, son, I'm not sure that when whites are no longer the majority in America, that they will really want to still have democracy. And when he said that, I thought he had lost his mind. And then a few years later, the pre-clearance clause of the voting rights bill was gutted. And then not the next year, the very next day, states put in new policies, started paperwork to take away voting rights. And we're seeing that play out now. And so later, when I saw that happen, I went back to Dad and I said, remember that interview? And you said, and he says, yes, I do remember that. And so he saw what's happening now coming. Now, anybody in America could have seen that if we taught real American history. But because the school system doesn't teach, school systems don't teach American history, we get taught American mythology. So people are not seeing these things coming. But if we knew the real history of America, we could see it coming, and would also make it harder to pull the wool over the eyes of good white brothers and sisters who want to do the right thing, but they don't know because they've never seen this. So they don't believe. They're like, oh, well, yeah, who cares about showing an ID to vote? Of course you should do that. Yeah, but let's look at the real, what's going on behind that. If they knew real history, we'd be able to have a more just, fair society. But because we haven't been taught real history, the wool is getting pulled over people's eyes. Very good people at the same time.
Okay. Steve, what are your thoughts about that?
I'd say three things. One, he's a strong believer in the importance of strategy, and that strategy, a unified strategy, was important, and that was more difficult these days because we're just more spread out, and there's not one kind of central organization. Two, I think he regretted the fact that the church wasn't as involved as it might have been in the past, from his days and Ambassador Young's days. And three, he believed so strongly in Dr. King and saw him as a prophet that I think, even though he realized these were different times, there was a kind of a longing for there to be one kind of central, unifying, galvanizing figure around whom the strategy might be able to be centered.
Okay. Ambassador Young.
No, that was very interesting because I have always been trying to convince myself that it's always going to work out fine. And I don't care how rough it is, and I don't care how difficult the times are. I'm always looking for how can we put this together and make it work. So much so that even when I celebrated the Supreme Court the other day, that they accepted the Affordable Care Act, and I was thrilled because the young woman that President Trump appointed was supposedly very conservative. And that was true, but they didn't check to realize that she had 9 adopted children. And even on a Supreme Court justice's salary, you can't take care of the health of 9 children without some government assistance. That's, I'm going to always try to look for the silver lining because I know too many people, and I have seen too many people that have been angry and want to give up too early. And I can't put myself in that camp. And neither did CT. But what CT was willing to be much more realistic. And that the hymn, nobody told us that the way would be easy, but I don't believe he brought us this far to leave us.
Yeah.
Lord, I don't feel no ways tired. We've come too far from where we started from. And that's the Judeo-Christian spirit out of which we were raised. Martin used to say that Black people in slavery took Jeremiah's question mark when Jeremiah said, "Is there no balm in Gilead? No physician there?" And he said they straightened out Jeremiah's question mark into an exclamation point. that there is a balm in Gilead that heals the sin sick soul. And I'm always looking for a way to make it through difficult times, because I don't think the world ever stops.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think social change ever stops. And so I think that there will be setbacks. There are setbacks. But even in the setbacks, it's one step forward, two steps back, and then one step, another step forward. It's never a smooth road.
Mm-hmm.
Life is a struggle, and it's meant to be a struggle.
All right. So we got 4 minutes left, and I want to start with Andy Young on this last question. And Ambassador Young, you are one of 5 Black men in Atlanta who at the same time were presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom. You, Hank Aaron, John Lewis, Joseph Lowry, and Reverend C.T. Vivian. Going forward, and we look at how history judges us and how history looks at us, how will history look at Reverend Vivian? And I want everyone to answer this.
No, there's no question that Reverend Vivian was one of the architects of our history. I mean, Martin sent to him and asked him to join us because he needed his experience. And Jim Lawson couldn't come from California, but C.T. Vivian came from Nashville. And he was always a part of this team that believed in nonviolent social change and that believed in reconciliation, forgiveness, and the transformation of humanity to the kingdom of God.
All right. Steve, you're his biographer. How will history remember him?
Well, Ernie, at the beginning of the discussion, you were referenced as being a big fan of Hamilton.
Yeah.
And I look at Nashville in 1960 and also the SCLC, there you go, in general as being almost a 20th century version of Hamilton, where you have all these remarkable figures in the same place at the same time. Just as in Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton marvels, how did all these amazing thinkers and revolutionaries end up in the same place at the same time? I think that's Nashville, Diane Nash, Lafayette, Marion Barry, Bevel, etc., John Lewis, and I think it's SCLC. And I think that in some ways, C.T. Vivian is the Hamilton of that group. He's not as well known as some of the other figures in that group, but he's the thinker, he's the doer, he's the man of action. And I think he's beginning to get that recognition, and that will continue over the years to come.
So we need to get Lin-Manuel Miranda a copy of your book so that we can have that play in the next 5 or 10 years.
Absolutely.
All right.
Please
Al,
use your contacts.
okay. Al, how will America and the world remember your father?
I hope as a humble, kind, brilliant, godly, well-read thinker who wanted America to become what America had always professed to be. More importantly, I hope that the entire team, King's team, are known as the real true founding fathers of democracy. So while the others were the founding fathers of America, they were not the founding fathers of democracy, because the whole premise of a democracy is that the people get to select the government leadership via the vote. If millions of people are denied that right simply because of the color of their skin, that was not democracy. By textbook terms, that was a hypocrisy, calling yourself one thing while you're something else. These are the people that push the nation. Those men on King's team that we know of and their spouses are the ones that push this nation into becoming a true full democracy. So I'm hoping that they will all be remembered as the founding fathers and mothers of democracy in America, because that's truly who they were.
Well, thank you very much, Al. Thank you, Ambassador Young, and thank you, Steve Pfeiffer. I think this was a great presentation tonight. We had 80-something participants. And if you have any questions, please, reach out to well, I don't know if you have any questions, but I want to just thank everybody for coming. And also, I want to make sure this is an uncorrected proof, not for resale, but I do have the copy of the book here. So please get yourself a copy of It's in the Action, Steve Pfeiffer's wonderful book. Also, C.T. Vivian's book, Black Power and the American Myth, has been re-released, so please get a copy of that. Please get a copy of Andy Young's book, and please visit the Atlanta History Center. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I really appreciate you guys joining us tonight, and I'm going to turn it back over to Claire.
Thank you so much, Ernie. And thank you just so much, Steve, Al, and Ambassador Young. That was just such a wonderful discussion. The hour absolutely flew by, and I could sit here and listen to you guys talk for hours more. So if you're in the same boat as me, you have lots of books to choose from, as Ernie was saying. So make sure you grab a copy and enjoy those. So we have lots coming up at Atlanta History Center. We'd love to have you join us. This Wednesday, we'll be welcoming Adrian Miller for his new book, Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States of Barbecue. So don't come to this lecture hungry. I guarantee you it will be torturous. So that's a Wednesday at 7 p.m. And again, this event was part of our Atlanta History Center Juneteenth celebration, which lasted a month long. And I hope everyone had a wonderful Juneteenth this past weekend.
Now, Claire, I have one more thing.
Yeah.
I have one more book to plug. This is Mrs. Vivian's book, Coretta, The Story of Coretta Scott King.
All right.
Well, I have all the books, and I do. I want to thank Reverend Vivian for that. I was already a big reader, but I actually built this bookshelf after visiting his house, so I have everything. So please pick up this book as well. So there's a lot of stuff to read.
That's amazing. I'm adding the biography of Coretta to my list. I didn't know about that one. That's fantastic. Yeah. So just, again, thank you everyone so much for being here. If you're like me and you also feel inspired to go out and find a cause or something to do some good in, there's a really great event called the Civic Season. It's a nationwide history and civics organization. We're trying to use good history to inform civic participation, celebrated between Juneteenth and the 4th of July. So you can find more information about that at the website I just put in the chat. Again, thank you so much to our audience. Thank you so much to our panelists. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your Monday night. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.